Welcome to the next lesson in this chapter, which is going to be a fairly quick one. We are going to implement support for deleting a resource using the delete HTTP method. Here's a brief recap of what we covered so far. We added our habits controller to represent our base resource, which we called habits, using a plural noun as the route, which is one of the best practices that we discussed when we were talking about designing REST APIs. Then we implemented support for returning a collection of resources, returning a single resource, creating a resource, updating a resource using put, partially updating a resource using the patch HTTP method, and finally, we're going to introduce support for deleting a resource with HTTP delete. So here's what we have to do to implement this. I'm going to decorate my endpoint with the HTTP delete attribute, and we will have to specify the identifier of our resource in the route. Then let's make this method asynchronous, and it's going to return an action result, and let's call it delete habit. We're going to accept the identifier of the habit as the only argument that's going to be required. And then what do we need to do to implement this? Well, first, we need to fetch the habit from the database. So I will say database context, habits, first or default async, and then let's match the ID property of the habit to what we get from the route. Then if the habit is null, we're going to return a 404 not found response. Otherwise, we're going to say database context habits and remove it from this database set. Then we can persist these changes by calling save changes async. And finally, I can return 204 no content. Other possible options could be returning 200 OK. I prefer returning no content. And this is all we need to implement deleting a resource. So let's give this a try. And I'm going to walk you through the complete flow from creating a resource using our post endpoint. Let's send this request and create a new habit. We get the habit identifier that we can use to construct a delete request, but we also get a location header where we can send a get request to obtain a new instance of our resource. So if I were to send this, I'll get back the representation of the habit that I just created. And now if I replace this with the delete HTTP method and send this request, I will target the delete endpoint that we just implemented. But I'm going to omit this, and let's go into the delete habit request that I have here, and let me specify the habit identifier as a parameter. So now I'm going to send this request, and we will land on our breakpoint and first fetch the habit from the database. So you can see it's not null. We're going to remove it. We're going to persist the changes and return no content. Back inside of Postman, we get 204 no content, so everything is working as expected. Now let's send the same request again. Again, I will land on the breakpoint, but this time the habit that we get back from the database is null. So we're going to return 404 not found, and you can see that we are getting a problem details response. If you also take a look at the response headers, in the content type header, you can see that the content type is application/problem plus JSON. So this is what you're seeing in the response body. We're going to talk more about this in an upcoming lesson. So that's all there is to implementing delete on your RESTful API. Now let's get more specific. When we were talking about HTTP status codes, I said that you could consider returning 410 gone when you try to delete a resource that has already been deleted. There isn't such a method on the controller base class, so what you could do is return a status code response, and this allows you to specify a specific status code, and there's a static type that contains a set of constants where you can access the 410 gone status code. But this means that we have to track on the server whether or not such a resource existed. This might make sense if you want to implement support for soft deletes, which I don't want to be doing here. So the simplest and most correct approach would be returning 404 not found. Now, looking at the broader perspective of what a habit will represent inside of our system, there's a bit more related to this resource than just the basic route functionality that we were implementing so far. For example, we're going to introduce support for tagging our habits to allow us to easily categorize them. Then I want to implement support for adding specific entries, daily or weekly or monthly entries for my habits. And in that context, we have to ask ourselves if simply deleting a habit is a business operation that we want to support. maybe there is something else that we should consider. And this is where we can start talking about soft deletes. I also exposed an isArchive property on the habit that we can use for implementing something like this. So from a functional perspective, this is all we need to support the HTTP delete method and remove a resource from our API. From a business perspective, and remember that all REST APIs power a business, there is a bit more to consider. I mentioned soft deletes just a moment ago, and the difference between a hard delete and a soft delete is that when we are performing a soft delete, we are only flagging the resource as deleted. Typically, there will be an isDeleted flag and maybe a datetime property so that we can track when the entity was soft deleted. So instead of removing it completely from our database, it's going to remain in some intermediate state, and we won't be returning it to the client when we send a GET request for this resource. Now, this does give us additional options. For example, we can now support an undelete operation. This can be helpful if you want to prevent accidentally deleting resources from the client application, and you want to give your application users a chance to correct their mistake. As I already said, when we send a GET request, we want to filter out any soft deleted resources, so we don't want to return them at all. We could consider adding a database index that's going to help us speed up this operation, but you should consider if this is worth it in your case, and it may only make sense if you have a lot of soft deleted records that you could remove from the calculation with such an index. And I want to leave you with an important remark when we are considering soft deletes, and that is there a possibility that performing a soft delete is actually hiding a business operation? So if we take a look at the habit example, maybe instead of soft deleting a habit, we could just perform an archive operation. Semantically, this is a bit different. We could still technically use a delete request to perform an archive, although we could argue that a more appropriate HTTP method could be put or patch. Now, with situations like this, I say that you just pick one approach that you think works and be pragmatic about it, than being too pedantic and trying to conform to all of the semantics of the HTTP methods. Another example I could give you when it comes to soft deletes is think about an order. Can you really delete an order once you have placed it? Or are you maybe canceling an order? That's the perspective I want you to be thinking in. Whenever you reach for a soft delete, consider if there is a hidden business operation that may be more valuable if it were explicitly exposed in the API. So I'm going to slowly wrap up this lesson where we implemented support for deleting a resource. We have also wrapped up our CRUD implementation by implementing support for creating, reading, updating, and deleting a resource. And in the next lesson, we're going to introduce another resource. This is just going to be an overview lesson where I'll do some coding behind the scenes and demonstrate what I implemented before we move into more practical topics.